Welcome to Kingston WritersFest. My name is Cassell Miles, and I am one half of a collaborative team that has created a one-person play about the life of Josiah Henson. The play is called Josiah, and we recently completed a 2-week run live at Theater Orangeville in an outdoor venue dedicated for the purpose. And you can see the performance video streamed live through Theater Orangeville's website or through my website, josiahhensonproject.ca. And that segues into why I am very pleased to present Uncle Tom, Distorted Nostalgia. Now, I'm just going to read this directly right off of here. It's an acknowledgement I'm asked to say and happy to say about our presence here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the festival customarily takes place and where I sit tonight is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land, and we agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. Now, all those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in its spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We'll take a moment to acknowledge that, let that sink in. Now, we hope that you've followed the sponsorship acknowledgement video that was playing before the event started. I'd like to thank the Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of the festival. We're grateful to those organizations and individuals who support the festival. And with that said, Kingston WritersFest would especially like to thank, yay, one of my favorite people, Marianne Higgs, author, patron of Cheryl Thompson, the Word on the Streets Toronto, our arts partner, and Queen's University Library, our community sponsor for this event. Now, this event is an hour long and includes a question and answer period. Now, feel free to type your questions into the question box at any point during the event for the moderator. If you'd like to support the author or authors by picking up a copy of their books, our official bookseller, Novel Idea, has copies available to purchase in store, by phone, or online, one of my favorite bookstores as well. So here we are. This is why I'm here. Josiah Henson and Uncle Tom. What's the connection? Let me introduce to you, and please help me to welcome Cheryl Thompson. Now, Cheryl Thompson is an assistant professor at Ryerson University in the School of Creative Industries. She is author of Uncle, Race, Nostalgia, and the Politics of Loyalty, Beauty in a Box, Detangling the Roots of Canada's Black Beauty Culture, a lot of detangling there, and is currently working on her third book on Canada's history of blackface as performance and anti-Black racism. Now, her book has appeared in numerous publications, and she was born and raised in Toronto, yay, Toronto, where she currently resides. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Cheryl Thompson.
Thank you so much, Castle, for that introduction. I love it. Though, to be clear, I was born in Toronto, raised in Scarborough.
Okay.
And now I'm back in Toronto.
Okay. I can't
throw my Scarborough people under the bus.
You know, okay, I got that. I first time I came to Jamaica at 7 years old, 1971, we lived in Scarborough, Victoria Park and Lawrence. So
that's right.
Scarborough peeps.
That's right. But thank you so much. So I actually have a slide presentation that's going to go along with my talk. So I'm just going to share my screen so that we can kind of get into the slides and to carry what I'm going to say in my actual talk. You know, and I teach for a living. I am a professor, and sometimes I think people get distracted by slides. So I don't want that to happen here this evening. But I think the slides that I'm going to show you are going to be helpful, because part of what I'm actually trying to do is to map out the story of the book. As was said in the introduction, my first book was about Black beauty culture. Okay. Then I wrote Uncle, and the next book is about blackface, essentially. And those three topics seem like they have absolutely nothing to do with one another, but they actually do. And so I want to start off by maybe taking the people who are here through a little journey about how it is that an author might come up with an idea, because this book was like an unexpected pregnancy. I didn't plan to write it. It was never in the cards to write this book. And in fact, when the idea to write this book came just as I was in the middle of editing Beauty in a Box. So Beauty in a Box was still in production when I signed a contract with Coach House Books. Big up Coach House Books, my publisher, to sign on to do this book. And so how did that happen? And so first, I do want to situate. I love that you talked about Josiah Henson. Here is a picture of Josiah Henson, because why Uncle Tom, right? And where did this idea come from? And where did it begin? And why did I write this book? And part of it was because of Josiah Henson, having taught at the University of Toronto for 3.5 years or so, a Black Canadian Studies course where I talked about Josiah Henson. I talked about Dresden. I talked about the Dawn settlement and all the ways in which Josiah Henson is intimately connected to Uncle Tom. That was actually my first introduction to, this is a topic. Then I went to the Uncle Tom's Cabin historic site in Dresden, and I was just having some feelings about what I was seeing and the way that story was weaved together. So that kind of, I always say for any author, you have like an origination moment. It's not necessarily the moment of writing. It's the moment that something is just in your head and you can't seem to get it out of your head. And you just keep, I think I've heard Malcolm Gladwell kind of talk about this too. It's like, you just keep thinking about this thing. And this was the origination moment. And then from there, 2017 happened. So I went to the Uncle Tom's historic site. That was like 2016, I think. In 2017, it happenstance, there was a Black History Month display at St. James Cathedral in Toronto. And I literally stumbled upon it. I didn't even know. I think I was waiting for the streetcar in Toronto on King Street. And I saw all these people going into the church. So I just thought, let me go into the church and see what's going on. And there was this display that again made a direct connection between Josiah Henson and Uncle Tom. These are images that I took of the display. And I thought, oh man, that was like another, Oprah would call it another aha. This was like another one. So I was like, okay, they're starting to add up. And then there was a situation where The Ward Uncovered was a book that came out in I think it was 2018. That's going to be my next slide. But before there was a commemoration at City Hall for a plate, an Uncle Tom's Cabin plate that they found at an archaeological dig that was behind the old City Hall. And it just so happened that I was forming a relationship with the editors of Coach House Books, who had done the first book, The Ward, and they were looking to do a second book, The Ward Uncovered. And it was just a symbiosis that I was asked to write about that Uncle Tom's Cabin plate that you just saw displayed. That was on display at City Hall. And so in this chapter that's in this book, I really just focus on the plate and how it is that an Uncle Tom's Cabin plate would end up in the city of Toronto at the time in the 19th century. And then through writing that chapter, I started to explore the material culture that is surrounding books. And I don't consider myself to be a historian, even though I read all these books about history. So it's kind of becoming a joke that I resist calling myself a historian. But I was just interested in the fact that how is it that in the present day, so if we take today's era, we have a dearth of understanding that books just don't sit in isolation. There's a media apparatus around the book. So you're going to go to an author signing, there's going to be publicity. There might even be, if it's in the case of, say, a Harry Potter, there's going to be all this memorabilia. And then we're going to imagine the book being adapted into a screenplay that's going to become a film. I was just interested in thinking about that same adaptation and the same morphing of one let's say something that starts in one content and then it gets morphed into another form and is presented as a different content, I started to think about how maybe that didn't start in the 20th century. That probably goes back to the 19th century. And that's where I started to really develop a real in-depth interest in Uncle Tom's Cabin, knowing that it was the most read book of the 19th century. And even to this day, I think it is the book that has been translated in more languages. The only thing that comes close is the Bible. And that's even including Harry Potter. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin is still this thing that has never really gone away. And so in doing all those projects and engaging in all these I call them like moments of, not just like aha, but it's like almost like these catalyst moments of witnessing. So you're witnessing the return of something in the present that has to do with the past. I just realized that this was a book. And when I spoke to my editor, John, he was convinced that this was a book. And so that's where this book came from. So it's really important to understand that I wrote this book as I was finishing my first book. Literally, I was still finishing the first book when I started writing this book. And then in 2019, a very sudden, some would say tragic incident happened to me where I was severely injured and I ended up being bedridden for many months in the hospital. And so that happened just a few months after I had submitted my first book to the publisher, like the final proof. I'd read the proof and it was done. And then I had this injury and then I was bedridden. And then I started to panic, not just about my health, but I was thinking, how in the world am I going to write a second book when I can't literally get out of bed? So there was a few months of panic. And then just my nature, I'm sort of one of those people who likes to take lemons and make lemonade. And so that's exactly what I did. Once I got well enough, I started to focus in on this book. And what I wanted to do was to really make this book a story. I'm an academic. Academics write books about history and culture and all the stuff, right? And often those books are very heavy. And they're very like dense, and you feel like you need to have a degree to even understand what it is that you're reading. I didn't want this to be that. I wanted this to feel like somebody was bearing witness throughout the last 170 years to all the shifts and changes that have happened in Uncle Tom's life. And so these were kind of some of my guiding questions. How did Uncle Tom migrate from the pages of a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe to become a centerpiece in advertising? Certain advertising trademarks that some of us might be familiar with, such as Uncle Ben, Aunt Jemima, Rastus, the cream of wheat trademark. All of those trademarks can trace their origins back to Uncle Tom. Then you have the stage where Uncle Tom became a centerpiece of the theater. Almost immediately after the book's release in 1851 too, by 1853, you already have stage adaptations of Uncle Tom. And at that time, they would have been blackface performance. And that should explain my third book, because that's where the third book idea is actually also originating from. And then you have the vaudeville era through theater, and then that morphs into radio. And what's really important in the book, I kind of get into this as well. Most people don't realize that copyright law as we know it today really doesn't exist in the 19th century. So anyone and everyone is sort of making up their own adaptations of this book. And so in my book, I kind of explain how theater magnates kind of took liberty with the narrative of the book. And so through the stage adaptation, which then begets the film adaptation, because the filmmakers went to the theater scripts to adapt into film. They did not go to the novel to adapt into film. What you have is a morphing of the story and a morphing of who Uncle Tom is to begin with. And by the time you get to the film adaptations in the early 20th century, the character and the narrative really bears a slight resemblance to the issues of the novel, but they've actually changed dramatically. And then the second question that really led me is, by mid 20th century, Uncle Tom is actually an epithet that gets thrown at people. It's actually a negative thing if somebody calls you an Uncle Tom. It's an insult. And so I wanted to understand how that transition happened. When and where does it shift from being this character that we see in books, on stage, in advertising, and then in radio? One of the first radio performances that's ever broadcast actually is an entire reading of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So even in radio, it's like one of the first texts that gets adapted to that medium. So part of my interest in the topic too is that I have a PhD in communication studies. So I'm always intimately interested in media and thinking about media industries and how the role that the media industries play in reintroducing us to things of the past. For example, in the present, if you're paying attention, there's a lot of media content about Princess Diana suddenly for a whole new generation to remember what actually happened. And so the past should also be remembered in the same way. So the literature of the 19th century, many of the books of the 19th century became the film adaptations of Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. For example, the ones that we probably have all seen, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, and many others. Those were 19th century texts that were adapted into screenplays in the 20th century. Now, none of us were alive in the 19th century, so our engagement with that material is as a film. And so that means we got an adapted version of the original. That storyline of the adaptation of film that started as a text, that's really what led me to this book, because knowing media as I do, having studied it, is that once something gets adapted, it's not just I mean, Marshall McLuhan talked about this, right? The medium is the message, right? It's not just that the content gets changed. It's through the medium that is now projecting the content to a different audience that its actual intention is also being changed. So the fact that we watch something that was a book and we watch it as a film, it's the film that's also changing us. It's not just the fact that it's the dialogue and the narrative. And so I wanted to take that same theory and kind of understand it through the lens of Uncle Tom. And so what I'm going to take you through now is just a little sampling of all the journey that I think you go on in the book. It really is a historical journey through time, through medium, through form, through content, and through sociocultural shifts that happen in the North American context. While the book is primarily focused on the United States, it's a transnational book, because you really can't talk about Uncle Tom without acknowledging Josiah Henson, who is actually not on this timeline, because I had to leave a little something for you to discover when you read the book. But here, so let me just begin, and I'm not going to read what's exactly on the screen, because obviously you can see it, but it's just to give you a sense of time, because the book is really split into 3 sections, where I section the discussion around this sort of mid to late 19th century, early 20th century moment when the novel changes to the theater, changes to film, and all the sociocultural ways in which that impacted people's engagement with this book. Because, you know, the way we study history, we often study it in decades, like we talk about swaths of time. Understand that by 1903, Harriet Beecher Stowe, most people don't know who she is anymore. It's much like, think about the people you knew in your childhood. Ask your kids about them today, and they probably don't know who you're talking about. So that's the case with Uncle Tom. By the 20th century, the memories of that book as a catalyst, for those who don't know, Uncle Tom really is thought of as a catalyst for igniting the Civil War, because it tried to humanize the enslaved experience through the story that is sort of a dualistic story. So you have the fugitive story of George and Eliza, who flee to Canada for freedom. Then you have the story of Uncle Tom and others who are essentially stay behind in the Southern plantation, and who at a certain point acquiesce to their own subjugation in the banner of being Christians and being good, loyal subjects, essentially. And so Uncle Tom ends up dying in that novel, a martyr's death, in that he is beaten to death by his plantation owner, but he takes that death in the name of pie in the sky, and that there's, he's in heaven now once he dies. So there's better, essentially, instead of Uncle Tom being a catalytic figure to make change in the present, the novel presents him as dying for the greater cause of life beyond the present. And so hence Uncle Tom gets taken up throughout the decades as a very loyal, noble Christian person, while the enslaved persons who flee to the north, and this especially comes through in the stage adaptations. So once Uncle Tom gets adapted to the stage, you see here in 1854, they start to pit the characters of the fugitive slaves as being really evil, as something is wrong with these people. Like they're the bad people in the novel, whereas Uncle Tom, again, is taking on this nobility. He's loyal, he's kind, he's passive. And then through all these various forms, especially with Uncle Remus, who I'm going to return to, you have an Uncle Tom-esque image of Black masculinity that is loyal and good. And that is the image that then gets sold through advertising, through the image of Uncle Ben, although Uncle Ben comes in the 40s. Uncle Ben is actually not centuries old. Uncle Ben is something of the post-World War, World War II era. But really you have the invention of the advertising trademark person who is smiling. I think of Aunt Jemima, always with a smile and always happy. And so that imagery, once it's adapted to film in 1903, kind of sends the message of like a Black population that is actually happy and contented. And of course, it's in 1915, I believe, if I'm getting my dates right, that you have A Birth of a Nation, which then tells another story of slavery that is very different than the story told of in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so it's in this like 20th century, 1914-ish, another Uncle Tom. This is the first time a Black man actually plays Uncle Tom. The first filmic rendition of Uncle Tom's Cabin is actually a white person in blackface. Again, thinking about my next book, that's where it's coming from. And so in this section here to around the 1950s, this is when you have film. The filmic story of Uncle Tom is actually the one that when people talk about Uncle Tom, this is probably really what they're talking about. Most people don't remember the 19th century because none of us were there, unless you're 150 years old. Those people might exist, but nobody was there. So our memory, and even if you read the novel, you're reading it from a contemporary lens, and half the time you might not even understand some of the things that's in the novel today because they seem very antiquated. So it's this moment that has really framed the moment that we're in now. And so here you have especially Stephen Feshett. If no one is familiar, this was a character, a stock character in Hollywood films, especially through the 1930s, who was dim-witted, slow, just a negative depiction of Black people, many would say. This was the image that was repeated consistently. And at the same time, through the 1930s, I'm just plucking out some examples here, but really in the 1930s, one of the things that I talk about is the adaptation of the slave narratives of the 19th century got adapted in the 1930s. So there's a lot of plantation films in the 1930s, with Gone with the Wind, 1939, kind of capping that genre, where what is the narrative of Black people, that we are enslaved, but we're so happy. We're there to help. We're not going to flee. We're very loyal. So that narrative, while there's no Uncle Tom in those pictures specifically, the depictions were of the same stock characterization: loyal, willing to die a martyr's death if need be, will never run away, and certainly don't have any interest in emancipation and freedom. You'd rather stay enslaved. And so that's what gets taken up into the 40s. And then we have the Song of the South moment. most people have never seen this movie, myself included, because it was put into the vault. And even to this day, even on Disney Plus and the streaming services, it's still considered too racist to include on those services. So the only way you can access Song of the South is if you buy it through some kind of eBay situation for like $1,000 or whatever they're selling it for. But Song of the South is a catalyst moment because it's the moment in the 1940s where you actually have the big, although we capstone the 1960s as the civil rights movement, it actually starts in the 40s. In the 1940s, you have African Americans literally protesting outside of theaters, Song of the South, because Song of the South was reconnecting to that 19th century Uncle Remus, Uncle Tom trope that was reinvented through an animation, but that was also live action. So Song of the South is actually, for many people, it is a technological wonder, because in the 1940s, it's a live action film with animation. And if you've ever seen clips, it is kind of, and also it's shot in Technicolor. So it's a beautiful film to watch, but the narrative of that film also was perpetuating a certain image of Black men and women that in the 1940s, the NAACP was actively protesting against. And I think in the book, I try to, in this middle section of the 40s to the 60s, I try to paint a more complicated picture of protest and emancipation, and the fact that, you know, a lot of people were doing this early work, but it didn't get recognized until the 1960s. That was just like the catalyst moment, but it actually been decades in the making. And then I get to Amos and Andy. And Amos and Andy is another catalytic moment because this is the jump from film to television. For those who might not know, it's television really hits its mass viewership in the 50s, while really invented in the 40s. So even 48, 49, there would have been people who might have had television. By the time you got into the 50s, increasingly everyone started to have at least one television in their house. And so Amos and Andy jumps from radio, where it was presented in the 1920s, 30s as a blackface radio performance. Can you imagine? So even though it was a radio show, it was actually white actors in blackface in front of a live studio audience performing as Amos and Andy. By the time you got into the 1950s, again, in large part due to the NAACP and protests, there was a little sense of consciousness that was hitting the television studios that, you know, I don't think we can bring that white cast in blackface onto the medium of television. And so instead, they had the idea of casting Amos and Andy with an all Black cast, but still asking them to perform the stereotypes of what was recognizable from radio. So Amos and Andy is also kind of this catalyst moment of, okay, yes, there's a Black show on television. And many people, you know, Bell Hooks, who's an African-American Black feminist media scholar, really zeroed in on the character of Sapphire. So there was a character in this show called Sapphire who was very loud, emasculating, aggressive. And so that characterization of Black womanhood has actually lingered on because, again, this was the first TV show. And I think what I do in the book is I try to point to the fact that whatever gets adapted first sets a template for what's to follow. And so just like Uncle Tom's Cabin, when adapted to the theater, was adapted in blackface, that's what followed. When the film was adapted in 1903, again in blackface, it continued, right? So Amos and Andy, as the adapted version of a radio program put onto television, just brought the same stereotypes from the radio, plopped it onto the small screen. But then we get into this last section that I unpack in the book. This last section is the section that's really complicated. As you can see, I'm talking about a lot of people. I'm talking about a lot of things that most of us remember, either we experienced or, you know, we were right there. And I'm trying to present in this sort of the last section of the book, a more complicated understanding of how these figures have helped to keep Uncle Tom alive in some regard, but also have presented a counter, like an oppositional stance to this figure of Black masculinity. And no one really epitomizes that more than Muhammad Ali. And for those of you who have PBS, this is not really a plug, but I have PBS. There's a series, a 4-part series of Muhammad Ali that is currently on PBS. What timing? And I think it's because he is the first figure in the 20th century who appears to be everything that Uncle Tom is not. He's not quiet. He's not passive. He's a sexual man. Clearly, his physical. He's beautiful, and he tells you exactly what he's thinking. But at the same time, what I talk about in the book is one of the things that made Muhammad Ali so unique, is that he would call other Black boxers Uncle Tom. There's a famous fight that I talk about in the book. I don't think it was with any boxing fans. If you're a boxing fan, maybe you know, it wasn't Sonny Liston, but it might have been another boxer that I talk about in the book that I can't remember the name of now, which is unfortunate. But in the ring, while he was literally beating him, he was calling him Uncle Tom, and it was picked up by media. So this is the first moment really of the 20th century where you have another Black man calling a Black man Uncle Tom. And you have a clear dichotomy between two individuals who are of the same racial group, but are clearly very different people. And so through the 70s and 80s, these examples that I really dig deep in the book, O.J. Simpson, first as a football player, arguably the greatest running back of all time. Then when we return to O.J. Simpson in the 1990s, accused of murdering his wife, ex-wife at the time. And then through the trial of the century, being framed as a Black hero, as sort of the Muhammad Ali of the trial, while Christopher Darden, who was on the prosecution side, is framed as an Uncle Tom. So in the book, I kind of explain the nuance of how that happened, how it is that a person in the 1970s who literally never even identified as Black suddenly became the Blackest man in America while he was on trial for murder in Los Angeles in 1995. And so in the book, I kind of capstone that story. And in the middle section of that time period between the 70s and the 90s, I really sort of unpack Bill Cosby in a way that I think is nuanced, because I situate Bill Cosby in a conversation about politics, American politics, especially the rise of Black conservatism in the 1980s and the reign of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and that sort of neoliberalism that comes to dominate the Western world in the 1980s, and a new sense of individualism and the pursuit of higher education. And so it's in this time period that in the United States, but across the Western world, you have the ascension of Black people in terms of education, in terms of, you have the migration to the suburbs, and sort of the people achieving status in many fields, sports, entertainment, the law profession, politics. Suddenly there's a new representation and a new identity of what it means to be Black. And a lot of that is steeped in policy changes and sort of community movements and shifts that happened between the 1960s and 1980s. So in the book, I don't just talk about Uncle Tom. I also try to create a sociocultural, like lay the land in a sociocultural framework of what was really going on in America and also in Canada at that time, related to politics and policy and decisions. And, you know, one of the things I also try to kind of flesh out is how the migration out of inner cities in the United States to the suburbs, and sort of the, just generally speaking, the urban renewal projects of the 50s and 60s, those events that I kind of talk about did not just move people to other geographic spaces. What they also did is they changed the way that people think about space and place and who belongs where. And so by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, and you have this, the panorama, if you will, of urban America being predominantly Black, that sets up a dichotomy between who's Black in terms of authenticity and who isn't. And so this is the new era that I kind of end the book talking about, that leaves us in a quandary. And you see in the book, I talk about Barack Obama, and then I talk about the shift that's happening with a product like Uncle Ben's, that's now Ben's Original. We're still in a moment of debating who is authentically Black. What does it mean to be authentic? And if you ascend in the Western world to high levels of power, such as Barack Obama, what pressures are on you in terms of who you serve? Do you serve Black community? Or in this role where you're basically elected to represent everyone, is it your job to just serve everyone and not really put a special focus on Black community? And then if you don't put a special focus on Black community, are you an Uncle Tom? Are you a sellout to your community? And then conversely, all of these iconic brands, Aunt Jemima, Cream of Wheat, Uncle Ben, they've all decided, well, we're going to, because of 2020 and George Floyd, who I do talk about in the conclusion, that they all said, you know, we're going to finally change our name. The time has come. And so all of these products, Aunt Jemima products, by the way, is no longer Aunt Jemima. It's now Pearl Milling Company, which is the original name of the product from the late 19th century. They've all decided they're changing their name. Cream of Wheat, I'm not sure what they're going to become, or Rustus. I don't know what's going to happen with that person. But here we have Uncle Ben, now Ben's Original. And so the current debates that the book really doesn't resolve, sorry, I don't give conclusions because it's still ongoing. And one of the things I try to do is to just present the story, like I said, and leave it to you to decide. You know, do you agree with this story? Do you think there's things that, you know, do you see a shift that might happen? Or, you know, I think one of the things I kind of say at the end is Uncle Tom is not going away. So it's kind of a question of how do we live with this character? And what does it mean that they won't go away? Because I don't think they will. And so that's kind of what my book tries to do. Thank you so much. I just wanted to take you on a journey of how it came to be and what it is. And I hope that you enjoyed this talk and that there's questions to unpack in the discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Are there any questions, or should I address them? Anyone? I'm not sure who's here. I see Castle had to step away. Okay, I do see a question. Oh, just formulating. Okay, thank you, Nina.
So as a co-host, I can't use the question and answer box, but I was wondering if there was, I believe you mentioned earlier that the book was one of the most translated books to exist. And I was wondering like what in particular made it so popular, I guess, for lack of a better term, that it was translated so many times.
Well, because I do talk about this in the book, because the book was, so there were two publishers of the book. There was an American publisher and there was a British publisher. And at that time in the 19th century, most of the world, like there is a reason why English is spoken in most countries in the world. And it's because at that time, the British Empire, as it would have been known, had its colonies around the world. And, you know, what does the colonial power do but send its own products to the colonies? So that's what was sent to the colonies. And at that time as well, most printing was probably predominantly in the language of Europe. So printing was happening in English, Spanish, French. Probably that was the majority of it in the Western world. And so because this book was so popular in America, so popular in the UK, and then sent to the colonies through routes of transit, through sharing, through travel, this is the book that circulated. And it was also one of the first books to be to have so many illustrations. So even if you did not read English and say the book was not translated into a language, it was highly illustrated. And most 19th century books were not illustrated. They did not have images. This one did. And so because it had images, you could almost follow along without even being able to understand the text. And I would compare it to the blockbuster movie of today. You know, you don't really have to speak and understand English, for example, to watch the Fast and the Furious movies. In fact, most of those movies don't even get dubbed anymore because you can kind of understand just by watching the images what's going on. So Uncle Tom's Cabin was really the same way. So I'll just maybe if I guess I should just answer the questions that are coming in the Q&A. I see one here that says, if you were to have written about a female character that had as many complex stereotypes derived from it, who might that be? Well, I do talk a lot about Aunt Jemima in the book, actually. There's quite a few, quite a few chapters. And I also talk about, there's a character from Uncle Tom's Cabin, Little Eva, who is the young white child who ends up dying in the novel through illness. And I talk about Little Eva because Little Eva actually has also kept returning. And you see Little Eva in Shirley Temple. If any of you are familiar with the Shirley Temple films of the 1930s, that's essentially an adapted Little Eva of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then throughout the 20th century, you still see that figure of the white girl child with blonde ringlets. I'm thinking of Annie, the Annie movie and Broadway production in the 80s, kind of also a play on Little Eva. And why I can find connection with all of those images is because Little Eva is really the first kind of child character with a certain aesthetic who also ended up having a really terrible life. So that narrative of like the young girl, white girl child with blonde hair having a terrible life, just think about how many movies you've seen with that exact character. And I would bet you there's elements that if you were to read the book, you would see Little Eva in elements of those stories as well. I see another one. Can you tell us more about the author of the original Uncle Tom's Cabin? How was she perceived at the time? Yes, so Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was born in the Northeast of the United States, had no connection to slavery, did not really know much about slavery. But through her connection, I believe her father was, the Stowe family was very educated and well known. And so through her, and that's the reason she was able to get educated herself. Somehow, I can't remember how this happens, but somehow she connects with Josiah Henson. And at a certain point, they start exchanging letters. And so before Uncle Tom's Cabin is a novel, it appears as a serial in what's known as the National Era. This was sort of a northern abolitionist newspaper. So that's why I said 1851 too, because it's in 1851 that it appears as a serial. And that serial content is really her blending what she thinks slavery is with what Josiah Henson is telling her. And so that's the reason why people say that the Uncle Tom character was built and mimicked on Josiah Henson's life. Because if you don't know about Josiah Henson, he was also enslaved in the southern US, just like in the novel, in somewhere in Kentucky. And Josiah Henson's story is that just like Uncle Tom, he escorted enslaved people across state lines to other plantations because he was told to, but he never ran away himself. He would escort them across state lines and he would come right back to his master. It's at a certain point in his life, just like Uncle Tom, that he decides to run. And so he flees north to his freedom. Uncle Tom doesn't. So that's where she took a little play with the novel. But, you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe, let's just say she wasn't taken up the way the author of Harry Potter, whose name is like lapsing me now, who really has become a star author. Harriet Beecher Stowe was really not taken up in that way. You know, she didn't really become a star in that sense. She was credited by Abraham Lincoln as being the little lady that literally started the Civil War. So people saw her as a catalytic figure, but she didn't really, you know, it was the 19th century and notions of women and power were very different than they are today. But I can tell you it's on the centenary of her death that happens in 1911. She was born in 1811, that there was a lot of remembering of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that's the reason we still know who she is, not just the novel. So suddenly 1911, the horrors of the Civil War, long gone, because there's a generation that doesn't even remember it. And you have, you know, sort of this 20th century. The 20th century is a moment where people start looking back at the 19th century with different eyes. And that's the reason, like a couple of years ago, there was the debates about the monuments, the Civil War monuments. Most of those monuments were built somewhere between 1900 and 1930. They were not built in the 19th century. It's just that they were in the 20th century looking back, trying to remember the 19th century in the way that they wanted to remember it. So Harriet Beecher Stowe fits in that culture of remembering that just took off in the 1910s and 20s. I see another question here. What happened to Harriet Beecher Stowe after the book was published? Well, there you go. She never writes another book, but she does get taken up. So what happens in I think it was in the 1860s and 70s, it's the Chicago Exposition of 1893. If you were to look that up, that is the moment where they actually had all these different displays and these different palaces. They even had like what they called the White Palace, which was basically because it was the first time that there was an exhibition that was lit with electric lighting. So electric lighting kind of makes its debut in 1893. And at the same time, there's an entire pavilion that's dedicated to Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1893. And so the Chicago Exposition of 1893 is all about remembering the past, but also looking forward into the future. Aunt Jemima actually makes her debut at the Chicago Exposition of 1893. Same with the skyscraper, electric lighting, X-ray technology. A lot of the things that come to be in the 20th century have their birth in the 1893 Chicago Exposition. And so that's when Stowe again gets taken up once again as this figure that is really important, not just for the past and remembering, but to take America into the future. So that's kind of why she just never really went away. Excuse me. I see Nina saying, I'm curious to know what else was happening in American Black communities in the 1940s that gave rise to protests re Disney films. Well, it's in the 1940s that you have the World War II moment. And that moment is really pivotal because that's the first moment where African-American men in particular willfully enlisted to go to the war, to fight for freedom. The world's freedom, they're fighting a great evil. And yet they come back to America and they're second-class citizens. And then at the same time, you have certain breakthroughs that are happening. Jackie Robinson enters the major leagues in 1942, I believe it is. Huge, or 1945. That is another cataclysmic moment because you have the integration of major league sports that had never taken place. And then at the same time on the big screen, we're still seeing the mammies and the uncles, the menials and the step and fetches. People were getting tired of it. It was just a moment of something has to change here. This is not making sense. There are too many contradictions in American society. How could we be enlisting and fighting for America and come back and we're maids and menials and we're serving? It's like, it would just not, right? So anytime there's those major contradictions in a culture, it's going to boil up into protest. And so it's the beginning of the NAACP realizing that their fight is not just about social or political rights. They also have to fight a representational battle. And that's the beginning of demanding different representation on screen. It starts in the 1940s with all that was happening. I see another question. Would you suggest I read your book or Uncle Tom's Cabin first? I don't know. I can't answer that. Read my book. It might give you a sense of Uncle Tom's Cabin, because Uncle Tom's Cabin is very dense. So you might want to read my book first, maybe get a little sense of it and then go back into Uncle Tom's Cabin. But it's really your call. I mean, you know, can I say read both? Maybe try reading both at the same time. That would be different. Yeah, okay. Those are the questions that I see. Thank you. Those were good questions.
All right, I'll come back on and just thank you very much, Cheryl, for this conversation today. Interesting, a lot of food for thought, obviously, and very much looking forward to your next book that is coming out. I think we'll be very excited to see where that goes. I wanted to thank everybody for attending the event today. A reminder that Cheryl's book and the books of everyone that's appearing at the festival are for sale at our local independent bookseller, Novel Idea Books, which is downtown in Kingston. So you can order your books online, by phone, or in person, because we're finally back at that stage. Yeah, there is a survey for the festival. So we encourage you to visit our website and find out about that. And also, one lucky person today is going to win a copy of Uncle. So check out your emails, because you might be the lucky person. Yeah, thanks again so much for joining us on this first night of the festival.